This is the timeline of defining events in NASA and CSA history from 1958 to 2013. It all started on October 1st when National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, began operation. At the time, it consisted of 8,000 employees and a yearly budget of $100 million, which is not very much. On the 11th of October, the first NASA launch ever happened. It was the Pioneer 1, and it delivered to us 43 hours of data about the moon. There was a trajectory error, though, so it never actually reached the moon.
On the 28th of May in 1959, the United States launched and recovered 2 monkeys, April and Baker. The flight was successful, testing the capability to launch from Cape Canaveral in Florida and to recover spacecraft in the Atlantic Ocean.
On the 25th of May in 1961, President John F. Kennedy unveiled the commitment to execute Project Apollo on this date in a speech on urgent national needs. He said, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." The first lunar landing mission, Apollo 11, lifted off on the 16th of July in 1969, and after confirming that the hardware was working well, began the 3-day trip to the moon. The astronauts Neil A. Armstrong and Edwin E. Aldrin landed on the lunar surface while Michael Collins orbited overhead in the Apollo command module. After checkout, Armstrong set foot on the surface, telling millions of listeners that it was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Aldrin soon followed him out, and the two plodded around the landing site in the 1 out of 6 lunar gravity. Planted an American flag, but omitted claiming the land for the U.S., as had routinely been done during European exploration of the Americans. Then they collected soil and rock samples and set up some experiments. After more than 21 hours on the lunar surface, they returned to Collins on board Columbia, bringing 20.87 kilo of lunar surfaces with them.
The flight of the Apollo 13 was one of the near disasters of the Apollo program. At 56 hours into the flight, an oxygen tank in the Apollo service module ruptured and damaged several of the power, electrical, and life support systems. People throughout the world watched and waited and hoped as NASA personnel on the ground and crew, well on their way to the moon with no way of returning until they went around it, worked together to find a safe way home. While NASA engineers quickly determined that enough air, water, and electricity did not exist in the Apollo capsule for 3 astronauts until they could return to Earth, it was a close-run thing, but the crew returned safely on the 17th of April in 1970. The near disaster served several important purposes for the civil space program, especially prompting reconsideration of the propriety of the whole effort while also solidifying the popular mind NASA's technological genius.
On the 28th of January in 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger STS-51L was destroyed and its crew of 7. The explosion occurred 73 seconds into the flight as a result of the leak in one of the solid rocket boosters. The crew members of the Challenger represented a cross-section of the American population in terms of race, gender, geography, background, and religion. In 1990, the Hubble satellite was launched. The Hubble Space Telescope, or the HST, is a space telescope that was carried into orbit by a space shuttle in 1990 and remains in operation. A 24-meter, or 7.9 feet, aperture telescope in low Earth orbit. Hubble's 4 main instruments observe in the near-ultraviolet, visible, and near-infrared spectrum. The telescope is named after the astronomer Edwin Hubble. He needed an upgrade after his 10-inch hooker. On the 13th of January in 1996, NASA scientists announced the discovery of 3 black holes in 3 normal galaxies, suggesting that nearly all galaxies may harbor supermassive black holes which once powered quasars, but now are quiescent. This conclusion was based on a census of 27 nearby galaxies carried out by NASA's Hubble Space Telescope. Curiosity is a car-sized robotic rover exploring Gale Crater on Mars as part of NASA's Mars Science Laboratory missions. Curiosity was launched from Cape Canaveral on November 26, 2011, aboard the MSL spacecraft and successfully landed on Areolis Palus and Gale Crater on Mars on August 6, 2012. The rover's goals include investigation of the Martian climate and technology, assessment of whether the selected field site inside Gale Crater has ever offered environmental conditions favorable for microbial life, and investigation for the role of water and planetary habitability studies in preparation for future human exploration. Chris Austin Hadfield is a retired Canadian astronaut who is the first Canadian to walk in space. a former Royal Canadian Air Force fighter pilot. Hadfield has flown 2 space shuttle missions and served as commander of the International Space Station. Hadfield, who was raised on a farm in southern Ontario, was inspired as a child when he watched the Apollo 11 moon landing on TV. In 1992, he was accepted into the Canadian astronaut program by the Canadian Space Agency and visited the International Space Station, or the ISS, where we walked in space and helped to install the Canadarm2. He was responsible for a crew of 5 astronauts and helped to run dozens of scientific experiments dealing with the impact of low gravity on human biology. During the missions, he also gained popularity by chronicling life aboard the space station and taking pictures of the Earth and posting them through Twitter, Facebook, and Tumblr to a large following of people around the world. He was a guest on television news and talk shows and gained popularity by playing his guitar in space. His mission ended in May 2013 when he returned to Earth. Shortly after returning, he announced his retirement, capping a 35-year career as a military pilot and an astronaut.